more years.
I'm proud to lead such an amazing country.
George W. Bush keeps his job as United States President. On News and Review today, the U.S. election, choosing a president. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. On the first Tuesday in November, the people of the United States went to the polls to choose a president, and it turned out to be quite a nail-biter again. In 2000, the last time Americans voted for a president, it all came down to George Bush winning the state of Florida by just over 500 votes, and the result wasn't official until many days after people had voted. This year, Bush took on Democratic Party challenger John Kerry, and once again, election night ended without a clear winner. This is how the map of the United States looked at the end of election night. Any state painted red means Bush had won it. The blue ones belonged to Kerry. The red might look overwhelming, but some of those blue states have big populations, which helped Kerry get very close to Bush by the end of the night. States that weren't colored in meant they were too close to say who'd won, and the key one of those was Ohio. It was pretty clear a win there would put either Bush or Kerry over the top and into the White House, but no one could be absolutely sure until the next day.
I would not give up this fight if there was a chance that we would prevail. But it is now clear that even when all the provisional ballots are counted, which they will be, there won't be enough outstanding votes for us to be able to win Ohio.
John Kerry conceded defeat the afternoon after the election. He also appealed for unity in a nation badly divided over the choice for president.
I pledge to do my part to try to bridge the partisan divide. I know this is a difficult time for my supporters, but I ask them, all of you, to join me in doing that. Now, more than ever, with our soldiers in harm's way, we must stand together and succeed in Iraq and win the war on terror.
A newly re-elected George Bush also reached out to the other side of the divide.
A new term is a new opportunity to reach out to the whole nation. We have one country, one Constitution, and one future that binds us.
But bringing Americans together will be a big, difficult job.
Mr. Kerry.
No, better health care for reservists.
Mr. Kerry.
The Bush and Kerry camps spent more than $600 million U.S. on ads attacking each other. It was a nasty campaign that saw people split over many things: the war in Iraq, social issues such as abortion. The election also showed a split between people living in rural areas who tend to support Bush and people in cities who tend to support Kerry. So, two different sides lining up behind two different men. But if you go back a bit, you find that George Bush and John Kerry do have some things in common. Bush likes to portray himself as a conservative, plain-speaking Texas cowboy, different from the liberal Kerry, a New Englander with a background in law. But both are wealthy men who went to the same Ivy League university. Not only did they both go to Yale University, they were also members of the school's secretive social club, something called the Order of the Skull and Bones. Not so secret, a very different choice they each made when faced with one of the most divisive conflicts in American history: the Vietnam War. One signed up for it, the other chose a safer kind of service. John Kerry enlisted in the U.S. Navy, went to serve as an officer in Vietnam, and came back decorated with medals. As for George Bush, he wasn't in combat during that period. He was in Texas. With the help of his father, he got into the Texas National Guard and spent the war close to home. That didn't stop Bush supporters from attacking Kerry's war record.
John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
He is lying about his record.
This author, who covered the Vietnam War as a journalist, says the TV commercial shows just how mean-spirited this presidential campaign was.
I did not think that I would live in a time in America where one candidate had gone to a war and the other had not. But the other candidate, who sat it out in the National Guard, would unleash a series of commercials in effect trying to invalidate the candidate who'd gone to wars, medals and service. I find that so troubling, and just an America that is in a way unrecognizable to me.
I wake up every morning thinking about how to better protect our people.
The issue of how Kerry and Bush spent the Vietnam War caught some people's attention, perhaps because the United States is again involved in a messy war that is killing hundreds of American soldiers. The war in Iraq. It was a huge factor in this election, one of the big reasons Americans were so divided over who should be their president. Many people questioned the reasons George Bush went to war in Iraq. The reason he gave, that the country possessed weapons of mass destruction, seems to have been based on bad information. Many people also point out that attacking Iraq shouldn't have been a part of the so-called war on terror because Iraq wasn't responsible for the September 11th attacks. But other Americans see George Bush as a man of conviction who is a strong leader at a dangerous time. They believe him when he says the world is a safer place without Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq. They like the way he reacted after September 11th, which brings us to another huge factor in this election: fear. A CBC crew went to Las Vegas to look into the fear factor. Like voters in many places, those in the glittering gambling town were split down the middle, and fear was one of the things keeping them on opposite sides.
Policies of my opponent are dangerous for world peace. If they were implemented, they would make this world not more peaceful, but more dangerous.
The fear factor overshadowed another issue that has dominated American election campaigns in the past: the economy. Americans are worried about the economy. Unemployment is a concern. The country's budget deficit is the biggest ever. John Kerry tried to jump on the issue. But for most Americans, this wasn't about the country's economy as much as it was about the country's enemies. With that in mind, the CBC crew that went to Las Vegas interviewed some people passionately involved in this election.
All right, guys, where are we going? We're going to Vegas! Yeah!
Tricia Silver is part of a group called Driving Votes, a small nationwide army of Democrats. She is vehemently against George Bush's approach to the rest of the world.
I think that America has a need to rule. I don't know that I necessarily think that that is healthy, but but I believe that there is a way to be a benevolent ruler. There's a way to be kind and good and generous and have your country's best interests at heart while also having the world's best interests at heart. I really believe that there's a way to do that, but that is not what we are doing right now.
David 1, David 311.
Here is one of the voters Tricia Silver was about to meet in Las Vegas. Eric Aldays is a police officer with the local school board. Despite concerns he has about crime in his city, unemployment, and the U.S. deficit, he's most concerned about protecting the United States from its enemies.
I mean, they're willing to kill themselves to prove a point. How do you deal with somebody like that? You have to kill them first. I think George Bush, in one respect, whether people like him or not, I think people in the world that are not our allies, that are our enemies, I think they look at him and think this is a guy that, if given the chance to wipe us out if we try to cause a problem for America, I think this is a guy that will do it.
Now, watch what unfolds as Tricia meets Eric and his wife during door-to-door canvassing.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Anna. And I'm Tricia. And hi, Eric. Hi, Eric.
Eric and his wife Leanne talk with Tricia about wanting better social programs, about cleaning up the environment, about increasing school funding, just the kind of issues Democrats like to talk about. Finally, Tricia's colleague, Anna, asks the key question.
You've made up your mind? Which candidate are you thinking of supporting?
Bush.
You're going to support Bush? Mm-hmm. Okay. And same for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Based on what happened in September of '01 had a lot to do with it because, it was unscripted, he was untested, and I thought he handled it pretty good.
There's so much happening that the polls can't capture, but then you meet a guy like Eric and you wonder how many of him are out there.
How many of what are out there?
How many guys that are ostensibly Democrats who feel the way he feels, and we'll vote for President Bush.
People are saying it's the fear election. What are you afraid of?
I'm afraid of losing my rights. I'm afraid of America not... The only thing that differentiates the American democracy from any other democracy on the planet, because there's lots of them, is our Bill of Rights. You know, those 10 amendments to the Constitution. They're sacrosanct, and they've already been infringed upon by the Patriot Act. And to me, that makes me afraid.
By the final days of the campaign, George Bush's speeches were focused almost entirely on the war in Iraq and homeland security.
When I saw those images of the fire and death on September the 11th, I made a decision. Our country will not sit back and wait for future attacks. We will prevent those attacks by going after the enemy.
On the same day Bush said that, John Kerry countered with a special guest appearing just weeks after open heart surgery.
Now, one of Clinton's laws of politics is this. If one candidate's trying to scare you and the other one's trying to get you to think, if one candidate's appealing to your fears and the other one's appealing to your hopes, you better vote for the person who wants you to think and hope.
John Kerry and George Bush made thousands of appearances like this one during the campaign, but 3 times they appeared together debating each other on television. Kerry was in a must-win situation after some shaky weeks on the campaign trail, and he got off to a good start in the first debate.
I'll never give a veto to any country over our security, but I also know how to lead those alliances. This president has left them in shatters across the globe, and we're now 90% of the casualties in Iraq and 90% of the costs. I think that's wrong, and I think we can do better.
A lot of people thought Bush looked too uncomfortable, too irritated.
My opponent says help is on the way, but what kind of message to say to our troops in harm's way? Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time. That's not a message a commander-in-chief gives, or this is a great diversion.
But Bush's performance improved in the next 2 debates, and although Kerry was considered to have won all 3 contests, it didn't do his campaign much good. Then, shortly after the debates, voters were distracted by the sudden appearance of a feared and detested enemy. Osama bin Laden surfaced with a videotape message for Americans. In the video, bin Laden made a direct appeal to American voters. Your security is not in the hands of Kerry or Bush or Al-Qaeda, he said. Your security is in your hands. Any nation that does not attack us will be safe. Pundits were divided over the impact of the bin Laden tape. Most seemed to think that it would help Bush by scaring undecided voters. But on Election Day, Bush got an even bigger boost from a large group of Americans who believe that so-called moral issues were the issues of the campaign. Heather Hiscox has that story.
Social conservatives, evangelical Christians, they form one of the largest and fastest growing segments of the American population. They also form part of the natural base of Republican support, a part and a potential not fully appreciated until after the 2000 election. Party strategists calculated fully 4 million Christian conservatives hadn't voted. They set out to win every one of those votes this time.
Spouses for life.
First, with a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage.
Marriage cannot be severed from its cultural, religious, and natural roots without weakening the good influence of society.
Are John Kerry's priorities the same as yours?
The issue remained in the forefront during the campaign through pointed ads and presidential appeals at rally after rally.
We stand for institutions like marriage and family, which are the foundations of our society.
The strategy worked.
I believe that the candidate I'm voting for is the one that the Lord wants to be there.
Evangelical voters mobilized in massive numbers.
Moral issues, sort of that cultural divide, faith, religion, and such, were really touchstone important issues.
The single most important issue for many in determining their choice for president.
I believe in religion. I think if you're in
If you're the president of this country, you've got to lead by example, and I think our morals in this country have been going down for many years.
By voting overwhelmingly for Bush, the evangelical Christians may have played a decisive role in George Bush's convincing victory. But there may be a price to pay for that support. In his victory speech, Bush promised to reach out to those who didn't vote for him. But after such a bitterly contested election, that won't be easy. And it looks as if the United States will remain a deeply divided country for some time to come. And that's News and Review. I'm Carla Robinson. Thanks for watching. Pain at the pump as energy prices soar.
I just think it's out of control right now.
I should just stop driving it. That's the only way to save some money.
But in the long run, can supply keep up with demand?
This is the single most important problem on Earth because without adequate energy, nothing else actually works.
On News and Review today, energy shock. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. Oil prices have been soaring in recent months, hitting record highs of over $55 a barrel. Natural gas prices are up too. It's partly politics, instability in energy-producing nations like Nigeria and Iraq, but growing global demand is also to blame. The world's thirst for energy is growing rapidly, and now there are new worries over whether that thirst can be satisfied. The CBC's Havard Gould looks at why some think we could all be in for an energy shock.
Next, please welcome Matt Simmons, CEO and Chairman and CEO of Simmons & Company International. Mr. Simmons.
Well, first of all, I've always appreciated participating.
If this man is right, if he knows what he's talking about, we're all in very big trouble.
And this is the single most important problem on Earth because without adequate energy, nothing else actually works.
Matthew Simmons is an insider in the energy business, an investment banker, a man with connections. He spent decades putting together deals in the industry, and now he's worried.
And so we're really basically in a jam.
The first thing you have to understand about the oil and gas business is that it's cyclical. Prices go up and down. When prices rise, the industry gets busy finding new reserves or new ways to extract old reserves, like Canada's oil sands. As new supplies come to market, prices drop back down again. It's not quite as predictable as the movements of an oil donkey pumping up crude oil, but you get the idea. And the second thing you have to understand is that most people don't understand. They're not interested in cycles or history. They are completely focused on what they're paying now. And with oil prices surging in recent months, there's plenty of grumbling and griping at the pumps.
I think I should just stop driving it. That's the only way to save some money.
I just think it's out of control right now.
When you allow for inflation, oil and gasoline prices are not at record heights. But there's something extra underneath the usual complaints.
There's a growing concern now that this time it's different, that the old cycle has somehow been broken. And so energy prices may not slide back the same way, and more oil and natural gas may not be showing up, because this time the old pattern no longer applies.
What's changed? Many things, all at once. If it isn't conflict in the Middle East, it's political protests in Venezuela, or a strike in Nigeria, or Russia's biggest energy company locked in a battle with the Russian government. All factors that could disrupt shipments in a global energy system that's straining to meet demand, including new demand from China. That's the other part that's changed. The country's economy is surging and rapidly gobbling up resources: nickel, steel, copper, and oil.
I think demand is a runaway train, and that's a scary concept.
And here's the other scary thought. Usually, extra demand is met